Hello and welcome, class. My name is Mr. Sturgeon, and today we are going to be diving into Unit 1 of Government and Politics, known as Founding Fathers and Documents. Now, when I teach these lessons, I like to oftentimes break them up into very short chunks. So a lot of these videos will be 10 to 12 minutes long, and they will focus on one specific aspect of U.S. government and politics. But we're going to start off with Lesson 1.1, Issues with the Monarchy. Before we can dive into what happened and why we got to where we were, we need to understand the global effect of what was happening in the 17th and 18th centuries. Now, what was happening was a lot of these empires or a lot of these countries were ruled by a monarch. And monarch, it comes from the Latin phrase mono, which means one, and it really meant one member of a royal family who controlled most of the power. Now, this could be a king, it could be a queen, but oftentimes these monarchs were just one person, and they were oftentimes given this power from a church or a religion or some godlike figure or group who basically supported their claim to control all this power. Now, they would oftentimes have oligarchs in these monarchies. And what an oligarch is it's just a group or a few people who also control a lot of power. Now, they weren't necessarily kings or queens, but oligarchs were seen as like the elite. They were seen as the rich, the famous, the people who really controlled a lot of everyday life outside of the king or the queen. Now, when we talk about these monarchs and these oligarchs, we're often going to talk about them as being cruel or being tyrants. And they had a reason for that, just because they really didn't have to answer to anybody. They had all the power. They were the people who made the laws. They were the people who enforced the laws. They were the people who would even decide whether you were guilty or innocent. So if you were a commoner, you really couldn't push too much against the king or the queen or those oligarchs, because you would oftentimes either find yourself in jail or even in the extreme cases, oftentimes executed. So these monarchs and these oligarchs controlled the majority of the power in the 17th and 18th centuries. However, something occurred during this time. You may have seen it in U.S. history or world history. It was called the Enlightenment. Now, what this was, it was an age of reason, an age of science, and an age of philosophers. Really, what was occurring was a lot more people were becoming educated. And they were starting to question those authority figures, those religious figures. And they started to kind of think for themselves and say, you know what? We need to tell the commoners what's really going on. And so what these Enlightenment thinkers, is what they became known as, what they did was they wrote down a lot of their beliefs, a lot of their questions of authority. And this was able to be mass produced because of the Gutenberg printing press. What it did was it allowed for this mass production of pamphlets, of letters, of books to be made cheaper, which allowed even more people to hear and read and write about this questioning of authority. And some of the main Enlightenment thinkers you would need to know for government and politics in the United States, we're going to cover 3 of them today, but there are absolutely more. One of them is Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He wrote The Social Contract. Think of this as like the major book or the major pamphlet that people read about and started to say, you know what? This guy's questioning the monarchy. That's very, very controversial, but he's making a lot of sense. And what he basically argued was that he said, you know what? We don't need a monarchy. He believed that the people are naturally free and that they have the right to rule themselves if they want to. They don't need to listen to a monarch. Now, during the time, very controversial. And his ideas would spread towards other Enlightenment thinkers around Europe at the time and eventually to the colonies. One of those Enlightenment thinkers was John Locke. And he believed in a mixed government. So he had a very similar idea. And he said, you know what? I agree that we don't need this monarchy. We should have separate branches. We should have multiple branches of a government to lead us, to rule us, and that everyone has the right to life, liberty, and property. Now, a lot of these ideas sound very familiar. The reason for this is a lot of these Enlightenment thinkers would oftentimes write and they would read each other's stuff. And they would say, you know what, this guy's making great sense. Oftentimes they would meet in cafes or they would meet in taverns or parlors, and they would talk and they would give speeches and they would basically spread ideas to one another. So a lot of them had very similar ideas and maybe would build off of one another. And the reason I have this one starred is because this sounds a lot of what our founding fathers believed in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So again, very similar ideas, all being shared during the Enlightenment. Another very influential Enlightenment thinker was a man named Montesquieu. Now, this guy I want to focus on because he was the one who really said, you know what, we need an executive, a legislative, and judicial branch. Now, these branches, not only will they be separate, but they're going to be run by separate people, which at the time, very controversial because it was an early form of checks and balances where one branch could check the other. And no longer would it be just one king or queen who said, you know what, these are the laws, I'm going to enforce them, and I'm going to decide whether you're guilty or innocent. Montesquieu said, you know what, no, we need separate people to head each part, and they can check one another. Now, there's going to be a fourth Enlightenment thinker, Thomas Hobbes, who we will cover later in this unit, who is also very influential to our founding fathers during the time of the Revolution. Now, the issue with the monarchy during the Revolution, there were a lot of issues with it. It kind of all stemmed from the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War, even though it lasted for 9 years, but that's a technicality. But basically what happened is the French and the British, they were fighting over some land in the new Americas, and Britain eventually would win. And they thought to themselves, you know what? We fought and helped the colonists from the French. So what the colonists need to do is they need to start paying up. They need to start listening to our government. Now, that was a perfectly good reason to maybe start imposing some taxes to start paying for the war that was fought in the colonies. But the colonists obviously didn't like this. Things like the Stamp Act, they hated. They didn't like the Intolerable Acts. They didn't like all these things the British government started to do after the 7 Years' War. The British were starting to push too much into the colonies and starting to say, like, you need to start following our rules. And obviously, this would lead to the Boston Tea Party and eventually the Boston Massacre. And then eventually, after all these kind of skirmishes between the British royalty and the colonists, it would lead to so many grievances or complaints that the colonists finally said, you know what, forget it. We're not going to be colonists anymore. We're going to declare our independence. And so these were just some of the issues that were hurting our colonists before they declared independence. And so they declared independence. Now, a lot of their kind of complaints, a lot of their beliefs came from Thomas Paine, a man who, again, was influenced by those Enlightenment thinkers, and he wrote something called Common Sense. And basically what it said was, hey, these are just things that every person needs, and we're not getting them from King George. And our colonists were like, absolutely, we agree with you. And so they listed their own complaints. And our founding fathers came together and they said, you know what, let's make a breakup letter to King George. Let's declare our independence and let's list everything the king has neglected or abused or everything the king has done that we think is wrong. And that's essentially what the Declaration of Independence was. It was a breakup letter, and it was sent and it was spread throughout the world. And people, they said, you know what, these colonies, they mean business. They have declared independence from Great Britain. Now, the key thing to know for the next couple units and lessons is that there was no such thing as the United States yet. The United States did not exist. They were still the colonies. And each one of these states, Georgia, South Carolina, Virginia, Pennsylvania, they were all sovereign. They were all independent. They all had their own small governments. They all had their own small militias and militaries. They had their own money. They had their own rules and laws. And so there wasn't really a United States yet. And so our founding fathers, after the Declaration of Independence, had to come up with a form of government to keep our colonies together. So we declared our independence. Now we need to figure out how are we going to keep these colonies together, because guess what? We still have to fight the War of Independence, and we need to keep these colonies together and remain strong to fight Great Britain. And so that'll lead us to our next lesson, and that's going to be Unit 1.2, The Birth of a Democracy, where we're going to talk more about what government was formed and why it was formed that way. So enjoy.